The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street by Rod Serling. Act 1. Fade in on a shot of the night sky. The various heavenly bodies stand out in sharp, sparkling relief. The camera moves slowly across the heavens until it passes the horizon and stops on a sign that reads Maple Street. It is daytime. Then we see the street below. It's a quiet, tree-lined, small-town American street. The houses have front porches on which people sit and swing on gliders, talking across from house to house. Steve Brand is polishing his car, which is parked in front of his house. His neighbor, Don Martin, leans against the fender watching him. An ice cream vendor riding a bicycle is just in the process of stopping to sell some ice cream to a couple of kids. Two women gossip on the front lawn. Another man is watering his lawn with a garden hose. As we see these various activities, we hear the narrator's voice. Maple Street, USA, late summer. A tree-lined little world of front porch gliders, hopscotch, the laughter of children, and the bell of an ice cream vendor. There's a pause, and the camera moves over to a shot of the ice cream vendor and two small boys who are standing alongside just buying ice cream. At the sound of the roar and the flash of the light, it will be precisely 6:43 p.m. on Maple Street. At this moment, Tommy, one of the two boys buying ice cream from the vendor, looks up to listen to a tremendous screeching roar from overhead. A flash of light plays on the faces of both boys and then moves down the street and disappears. Various people leave their porches or stop what they're doing to stare up at the sky. Steve Brand, the man who'd been polishing his car, stands there transfixed, staring upwards. He looks at Don Martin, his neighbor from across the street. "What was that? A meteor?" "That's what it looked like. I didn't hear any crash, though, did you?" "Nope, I didn't hear anything except a roar." From her porch. "What was that?" Raising his voice and looking toward the porch. "Guess it was a meteor, honey. Came awful close, didn't it?" "Too close for my money. Much too close." The camera moves slowly across the various porches to people who stand there watching and talking in low, conversing tones. Maple Street, 6:44 p.m. on a late September evening. He pauses. Maple Street, in the last calm and reflective moment, pause, before the monsters came. The camera takes us across the porches again. A man is replacing a light bulb on a front porch. He gets off his stool to flick the switch and finds that nothing happens. Another man is working on an electric power mower. He plugs in the plug, flicks the switch of the mower off and on, but nothing happens. Through a window, we see a woman pushing her finger up and down on the dial hook of a telephone. Her voice sounds far away. "Operator? Operator! Something's wrong on the phone! Operator!" Myra Brand comes out on the porch and calls to Steve, calling. "Steve, the power's off. I had soup on the stove and the stove just stopped working." "Same thing over here. I can't get anybody on the phone either. The phone seems to be dead." We look down again on the street. Small, mildly disturbed voices are heard coming from below. "Electricity's off. Phone won't work." "Can't get a thing on the radio. My power mower won't move. Won't work at all. Radio's gone dead." Pete Van Horn, a tall, thin man, is seen standing in front of his house. "I'll cut through the backyard to see if the power's still on Floral Street. I'll be right back." He walks past the side of his house and disappears into the backyard. The camera pans down slowly until we're looking at 10 or 11 people standing around the street and overflowing to the curb and sidewalk. In the background is Steve Brand's car. Doesn't make sense. Why should the power go off all of a sudden and the phone line? Maybe some kind of an electrical storm or something. That don't seem likely. Sky's just as blue as anything. Not a cloud, no lightning, no thunder, no nothing. How could it be a storm? I can't get a thing on the radio, not even the portable. The people again begin to murmur softly in wonderment. "Well, why don't you go downtown and check with the police, though they'll probably think we're crazy or something. A little power failure, and right away we all get flustered and everything." "It isn't just the power failure, Charlie. If it was, we'd still be able to get a broadcast on the portable." There's a murmur of reaction to this. Steve looks from face to face and then at his car. "I'll run downtown. We'll get this all straightened out. He gets in the car and turns the key. Looking through the open car door, we see the crowd watching Steve from the other side. He starts the engine. It turns over sluggishly and then stops dead. He tries it again, and this time he can't get it to turn over. Then very slowly he turns the key back to off and gets out of the car. The people stare at Steve. He stands for a moment by the car and then walks toward them. I don't understand it. It was working fine before. Out of gas? Shakes his head. I just had it filled. What's it mean? It's just as if... Pause. As if everything had stopped. Then he turns towards Steve. We'd better walk downtown. Another murmur of assent to this. The two of us can go, Charlie. He turns to look back at the car. Couldn't be the meteor. A meteor couldn't do this. He and Charlie exchange a look. Then they start to walk away from the group. Tommy comes into view. He's a serious-faced young boy in spectacles. He stands halfway between the group and the two men who start to walk down the sidewalk. Mr. Brand, you'd better not. Why not? They don't want you to. Steve and Charlie exchange a grin, and Steve looks back toward the boy. Who doesn't want us to? Jerks his head in the general direction of the distant horizon. Them. Them? Who are them? Intently. Whoever was in that thing that came by overhead. Steve knits his brows for a moment, cocking his head questioningly. His voice is intense. What? Whoever was in that thing that came over. I don't think they want us to leave here. Steve leaves Charlie, walks over to the boy, and puts his hand on the boy's shoulder. He forces his voice to remain gentle. What do you mean? What are you talking about? They don't want us to leave. That's why they shut everything off. What makes you say that? Whatever gave you that idea? From the crowd. Now, isn't that the craziest thing you ever heard? Persistent, but a little frightened. It's always that way. In every story I ever read about a ship landing from outer space. To the boy's mother, Sally, who stands on the fringe of the crowd. From outer space yet. Sally, you better get that boy of yours up to bed. He's been reading too many comic books or seeing too many movies or something. Tommy, come over here and stop that kind of talk. Go ahead, Tommy. We'll be right back, and you'll see. That wasn't any ship or anything like it. That was just a meteor or something. Likely as not. He turns to the group, now trying very hard to sound more optimistic than he feels. No doubt it did have something to do with all this power failure and the rest of it. Meteors can do some crazy things, like sunspots. Picking up the cue. Sure, that's the kind of thing, like sunspots. They raise Cain with the radio reception all over the world. And this thing being so close, well, there's no telling what sort of stuff it can do. He wets his lips and smiles nervously. Go ahead, Charlie. You and Steve go into town and see if this isn't what's causing it all. Steve and Charlie walk away from the group down the sidewalk as the people watch silently. Tommy stares at them, biting his lips, and finally calls out again. Mr. Brand! The two men stop. Tommy takes a step toward them. Mr. Brand, please don't leave here. Steve and Charlie stop once again and turn toward the boy. In the crowd there's a murmur of irritation and concern, as if the boy's words, even though they didn't make sense, were bringing up fears that shouldn't be brought up. Tommy is both frightened and defiant. You might not even be able to get to town. It was that way in the story. Nobody could leave. Nobody except who? Except the people they sent down ahead of them. They looked just like humans. And it wasn't until the ship landed that... The boy suddenly stops, conscious of the people staring at him, and his mother, and of the sudden hush of the crowd. In a whisper, sensing the antagonism of the crowd, Tommy, please, son. Honey, don't talk that way. That kid shouldn't talk that way, and we shouldn't stand here listening to him. Why, this is the craziest thing I ever heard of. The kid tells us a comic book plot, and here we stand listening. Steve walks toward the camera and stops beside the boy. Go ahead, Tommy. What kind of story was this? What about the people they sent out ahead? That was the way they prepared things for the landing. They sent 4 people, A mother and a father and 2 kids who looked just like humans. But they weren't. There's another silence as Steve looks toward the crowd and then toward Tommy. He wears a tight grin. Well, I guess we'd better do then is to run a check on the neighborhood and see which one of us are really human. There's laughter at this, but it's a laughter that comes from a desperate attempt to lighten the atmosphere. The people look at one another in the middle of their laughter. Rubs his jaw nervously. I wonder if Laurel Street's got the same deal we got. He looks past the houses. Where is Pete Van Horn anyway? Isn't he back yet? Suddenly there's the sound of a car's engine starting to turn over. We look across the street toward the driveway of Les Goodman's house. He's at the wheel trying to start the car. Can you get started, Les? Les Goodman gets out of the car, shaking his head. No dice. He walks toward the group. He stops suddenly as, behind him, the car engine starts up all by itself. Les whirls around to stare at the car. The car idles roughly, smoke coming from the exhaust, the frame shaking gently. Les's eyes go wide and he runs over to his car. The people stare at the car. He got the car started somehow. He got his car started. The people continue to stare, caught up by this revelation and wildly frightened. How come his car just up and started like that? All by itself. He wasn't anywhere near it. It started all by itself. Don Martin approaches the group and stops a few feet away to look toward Les's car. And he never did come out to look at that thing that flew overhead. He wasn't even interested. He turns to the group, his face taut and serious. Why? Why didn't he come out with the rest of us to look? He always was an oddball. Him and his whole family. Real oddball. What do you say we ask him? The group start towards the house. In this brief fraction of a moment, it takes the first step toward changing from a group into a mob. The group members begin to head purposefully across the street toward the house. Steve stands in front of them. For a moment, their fear almost turns their walk into a wild stampede. But Steve's voice, loud and incisive and commanding, makes them stop. Wait a minute! Wait a minute! Let's not be a mob! The people stop, pause for a moment, and then, much more quietly and slowly, start to walk across the street. Les stands alone facing the people. I just don't understand it. I tried to start it and it wouldn't start. You saw me. All of you saw me. And now, just as suddenly as the engine started, it stops. And there's a long silence that's gradually intruded upon by the frightened murmuring of the people. I don't understand. I swear, I don't understand. What's happening? Maybe you better tell us. Nothing's working on the street. Nothing. No lights, no power, no radio. Then meaningfully, nothing except one car. Yours. The people's murmuring becomes a loud chant, filling the air with accusations and demands for action. 2 of the men pass on and head toward Les, who backs away from them against his car. He's cornered. Wait a minute now. You keep your distance, all of you. So I've got a car that starts by itself. Well, that's a freak thing, I admit it. But does that make me a criminal or something? I don't know why the car works. It just does. This stops the crowd momentarily, and Les, still backing away, goes toward his front porch. He goes up the steps and then stops, facing. What's it all about, Steve? Quietly. We're all on a monster kick, Les. Seems that the general impression holds that maybe one family isn't what we think they are. Monsters from outer space or something. Different from us. Aliens from the vast beyond. He chuckles. You know anybody that might fit that description around here on Maple Street? What is this? A gag? He looks around the group again. This a practical joke or something? Suddenly the car engine starts all by itself, runs for a moment, and stops. One woman begins to cry. The eyes of the crowd are cold and accusing. Now that's supposed to incriminate me, huh? The car engine goes off and on, and that really does it, doesn't it? He looks around at the faces of the people. I just don't understand it, any more than any of you do. He wets his lips, looking from face to face. Look, you all know me. We've lived here 5 years, right in this house. We're no different from any of the rest of you. We're no different at all, really. This whole thing is just weird. Well, if that's the case, Les Goodman, explain why. She stopped suddenly, clamping her mouth shut. Softly. Explain what? Interjecting. Look, let's forget this. Overlapping him. Go ahead. Let her talk. What about it? Explain what? A little reluctantly. Well, sometimes I go to bed late at night. A couple of times I'd come out here on the porch and I'd see Mr. Goodman here in the wee hours of the morning, standing out in front of his house, looking up at the sky. She looks around the circle of faces. That's right, looking up at the sky as if he were waiting for something. Pauses. As if he were looking for something. There's a murmur of reaction from the crowd again as Les backs away. She's crazy. Look, I can explain that. Please, I can really explain that. She's making it up anyway. Then he shouts, I tell you, she's making it up. He takes a step toward the crowd and they back away from him. He walks down the steps after them and they continue to back away. Suddenly, he's left completely alone, and he looks like a man caught in the middle of a menacing circle as the scene slowly fades. Act 2, Scene 1. Fade in on Maple Street at night. On the sidewalk, little knots of people stand around talking in low voices. At the end of each conversation, they look toward Les Goodman's house. From the various houses, we can see candlelight, but no electricity. The quiet that blankets the whole area is disturbed only by the almost whispered voices of the people standing around. In one group, Charlie stands staring across at the Goodman's house. 2 men stand across the street from it in almost sentry-like poses. In a small, hesitant voice, It just doesn't seem right, though, keeping watch on them. Why, he was right when he said he was one of our neighbors. Why, I've known Ethel Goodman ever since they moved in. We've been good friends. That don't prove a thing. Any guy who'd spend his time looking up at the sky early in the morning, well, there's something wrong with that kind of person. There's something that ain't legitimate. Maybe under normal circumstances we could let it go by, but these aren't normal circumstances. Why, look at this street. Nothing but candles. Why, it's like going back into the Dark Ages or something. Steve walks down the steps of his porch, down the street to the Goodman's house, and then stops at the foot of the steps. Les is standing there. Ethel Goodman behind him is very frightened. Just stay where you are, Steve. We don't want any trouble, but this time, if anybody sets foot on my porch, that's what they're going to get. Trouble. Look, Les, I've already explained to you people. I don't sleep very well at night sometimes. I get up and I take a walk and I look up at the sky. I look at the stars. That's exactly what he does. Why, this whole thing, it's some kind of madness or something. Nods grimly. That's exactly what it is. Some kind of madness. Shrill from across the street. You best watch who you're seen with, Steve. Till we get this all straightened out, you ain't exactly above suspicion yourself. Whirling around toward him. Or you, Charlie. Or any of us, it seems. From age 8 on up. What I'd like to know is, what are we going to do? Just stand around here all night? There's nothing else we can do. He turns back, looking toward Steve and Les again. One of them will tip their hand. They got to. Raising his voice. There's something you can do, Charlie. You can go home and keep your mouth shut. You can quit strutting around like a self-appointed judge and climb into bed and forget it. You sound real anxious to have that happen, Steve. I think we better keep our eye on you, too. As if he were taking the bit in his teeth, takes a hesitant step to the front. I think everything might as well come out now. He turns toward Steve. Your wife's done plenty of talking, Steve, about how odd you are. Picking this up, his eyes widening. Go ahead. Tell us what she said. Steve walks toward them from across the street. Go ahead. What's my wife said? Let's get it all out. Let's pick out every idiosyncrasy of every single man, woman, and child on the street. And then we might as well set up some kind of citizen's court. How about a firing squad at dawn, Charlie, so we can get rid of all the suspects? Narrow them down, make it easier for you. There's no need getting so upset, Steve. It's just that, well, Myra's talked about how there's been plenty of nights you spent hours down in your basement working on some kind of radio or something. Well, none of us have ever seen that radio. By this time, Steve has reached the group. He stands there defiantly. Go ahead, Steve. What kind of radio set you working on? I never seen it. Neither has anybody else. Who do you talk to on that radio set? And who talks to you? I'm surprised at you, Charlie. How come you're so dense all of a sudden? He pauses. Who do I talk to? I talk to monsters from outer space. I talk to three-headed green men who fly over here in what look like meteors. Myra Brand steps down from the porch, bites her lip, calls out, Steve! Steve, please! Then looking around frightened, she walks toward the group. It's just a ham radio set, that's all. I bought him a book on it myself. It's just a ham radio set. A lot of people have them. I can show it to you. It's right down in the basement. Whirls around toward her. Show them nothing. If they want to look inside our house, let them go and get a search warrant. Look, buddy, you can't afford to, interrupting him. Charlie, don't start telling me who's dangerous and who isn't and who's safe and who's a menace. He turns to the group and shouts, and you're with him too, all of you. You're standing here all set to crucify, all set to find a scapegoat, all desperate to point to some kind of finger at a neighbor. Well, now look, friends, the only thing that's going to happen is that we'll eat each other up alive. He stops abruptly as Charlie suddenly grabs his arm. In a hushed voice, that's not the only thing that can happen to us. Down the street, a figure has suddenly materialized in the gloom. In the silence, we hear the clickety-clack of slow, measured footsteps on concrete as the figure walks slowly toward them. One of the women lets out a stifled cry. Sally grabs her boy, as do a couple of other mothers, shouting, frightened, It's the monster! It's the monster! Another woman lets out a wail, and the people fall back in a group, staring toward the darkness and the approaching figure. The people stand in the shadows watching. Don Martin joins them, carrying a shotgun. He holds it up. We may need this. A shotgun? He pulls it out of Don's hand. No! Will anybody think a thought around here? Will you people wise up? What good would a shotgun do against... The dark figure continues to walk toward them. As the people stand there, fearful, mothers clutching children, men standing in front of their wives. Pulling the gun from Steve's hand. No more talk, Steve. You're going to talk us into a grave. You'd let whatever's out there walk right over us, wouldn't you? Well, some of us won't. Charlie swings around, raises the gun, and suddenly pulls the trigger. The sound of the shot explodes in the stillness. The figure suddenly lets out a small cry, stumbles forward onto his knees, and then falls forward on his face. Don, Charlie, and Steve race forward to him. Steve is there first and turns the man over. The crowd gathers around them. Slowly looks up. It's Pete Van Horn. In a hushed voice. Pete Van Horn? He was just going to go over to the next block to see if the power was on. You killed him, Charlie. You shot him dead. Looks around at the circle of faces, his eyes frightened, his face contorted. But I didn't know who he was. I certainly didn't know who he was. He comes walking out of the darkness. How am I supposed to know who he was? He grabs Steve. Steve, you know why I shot. How was I supposed to know he wasn't a monster or something? He grabs Don. We're all scared of the same thing. I was just trying to protect my home, that's all. Look, all of you, that's all I was trying to do. He looks down wildly at the body. I didn't know it was somebody we knew. I didn't know. There's a sudden hush and then an intake of breath in the group. Across the street, all the lights go on in one of the houses. In a hushed voice. Charlie, the lights just went on in your house. Why did the lights just go on? What about it, Charlie? How come you're the only one with lights now? That's what I'd like to know. You were so quick to kill, Charlie, and you were so quick to tell us we had to be careful of. Well, maybe you had to kill. Maybe Pete there was trying to tell us something. Maybe he'd found out something and came back to tell us who there was among us to watch out for. Charlie backs away from the group, his eyes wide with fright. No, it's nothing of the sort. I don't know why the lights are on. I swear I don't. Somebody's pulling a gag or something. He bumps against Steve, who grabs him and whirls him around. A gag? A gag? Charlie, there's a dead man on the sidewalk and you killed him. Does this thing look like a gag to you? Charlie breaks away and screams as he runs towards his house. No, please! A man breaks away from the crowd to chase Charlie. As the man tackles him and lands on top of him, the other people start to run toward them. Charlie gets up, breaks away from the other man's grasp, and lands a couple of desperate punches that push the man aside. Then he forces his way, fighting, through the crowd and jumps up on his front porch. Charlie is on his porch as a rock thrown from the group smashes a window beside him. The broken glass flying past him. A couple of pieces cut him. He stands there perspiring, rumpled, blood running down from a cut on the cheek. His wife breaks away from the group to throw herself into his arms. He buries his face against her. We can see the crowd converging on the porch. It must have been him. He's the one. We gotta get Charlie. Another rock lands on the porch. Charlie pushes his wife behind him, facing the group. Look, I swear to you, it isn't me. But I do know who it is. I swear to you, I do know who it is. I know who the monster is here. I know who it is that doesn't belong. I swear to you, I know. Pushing his way to the front of the crowd. All right, Charlie, let's hear it. Charlie's eyes dart around wildly. It's, screaming. Go ahead, Charlie. It's the kid. It's Tommy. He's the one. There's a gasp from the crowd as we see Sally holding the boy. Tommy at first doesn't understand, and then, realizing the eyes are all on him, buries his face against his mother. Backs away. That's crazy. He's only a boy. But he knew. He was the only one. He told us all about it. Well, how did he know? How could he have known? Various people take this up. How could he know? Who told him? Make the kid answer. The crowd starts to converge around the mother, who grabs Tommy and starts to run with him. The crowd starts to follow, at first walking fast and then running after him. Suddenly, Charlie's lights go off and the lights in other houses go on, then off. Shouting, It isn't the kid! It's Bob Weaver's house! It isn't Bob Weaver's house! It's Don Martin's place! I tell you it's the kid! It's Charlie! He's the one! People shout, accuse, and scream as the lights go on and off. Then, slowly, in the middle of this nightmarish confusion of sight and sound, the camera starts to pull away until once again we've reached the opening shot, looking at the Maple Street sign from high above. Scene 2. The camera continues to move away while gradually bringing into focus a field. We see the metal side of a spacecraft that sits shrouded in darkness. An open door throws out a beam of light from the illuminated interior. Two figures appear, silhouetted against the bright lights. We get only a vague feeling of form. Understand the procedure now? Just stop a few of their machines and radios and telephones and lawnmowers. Throw them into darkness for a few hours, and then just sit back and watch the pattern. And this pattern is always the same, with few variations. They pick the most dangerous enemy they can find, and it's themselves. All we need to do is sit back and watch. Then I take it this place, this Maple Street, is not unique? Shaking his head. By no means. Their world is full of Maple Streets, and we'll go from one to the other and let them destroy themselves. One to the other, one to the other, one to the other. Scene 3. The camera slowly moves up for a shot of the starry sky, and over this we hear the narrator's voice. The tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy. A thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all its own for the children and the children yet unborn. A pause. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the twilight zone. Fade to black.